the Donald Trump whiplash, a sudden policy change after days of bluster. Now, there is real news tonight, and it is about Iran. But I want to take a moment to walk through a wider context, because we've seen the same pattern in play on those big promised ICE raids that the president walked back. For the raids, it was a governing threat time to add heat to his 2020 kickoff, using the power of ICE and the feds to basically hype his own campaign rollout of immigration. Now then, by this weekend, Donald Trump all but admitted that was essentially a head fake, part of this pattern of head fakes. And this is important to understand the Iran news tonight, because sometimes you have a president literally creating the appearance of a problem so that he alone can solve it. Now, it often begins with some kind of tough talk, then a reaction, concern over the public plan announced by a president, but often in the end, it doesn't happen. So there was the Iran strike. You remember that, of course. There are these ICE raids that were canceled this weekend. Or more recently, there were those Mexico tariffs. Tweet, hype, but then fold. And it's more than simply playing for distraction, something that Donald Trump has been doing as long as he's been an entertainer. Because often, I want to point out to you tonight, the message itself can be the political payoff. Donald Trump's base wants to hear about ICE raids, about people being round up. So he gave them days of that message and perception. He may have already decided nothing was going to actually happen, but he gave his people some of the politics they wanted to hear. Now, if you watch The Beat, you may know we have an explicit news policy of trying to avoid some of the distractions. We don't cover, for example, random tweets. We have a much higher bar for ever putting a Trump tweet on the screen for you. We try to focus on what's actually happening. But of course, if a White House is marching towards war with Iran, and there are leaks about that really happening, or mass arrests of people in America, well, that becomes much harder to ignore out of hand, even if you know about what I'm calling this head fake pattern. Now to the news. Donald Trump announcing today what he is calling hard-hitting sanctions against Iran, and then he says it, quote, would have happened anyway. Take a look.
Iran has been a very dangerous player, very bad player. They're a nation of terror, and we won't put up with it. I would certainly send troops if we need them. Iran made a big mistake. They made a very bad mistake. Okay?
Mr. President, how will you respond?
You'll find out.
Are you willing to go to war with Iran?
You'll find out. You'll find out. I'm not looking for war. And if there is, it'll be obliteration like you've never seen before.
America's half-cocked president says he was cocked and loaded for a strike on Iran last night, but he called it off at the last minute.
Cocked and loaded. This is a president who knows about narrative, who knows about staging and casting, and he's trying to cast himself as the hero for calling off the very thing that he started. He is the one who threatened that airstrike. Although, of course, there was a downed drone. That's a real thing to deal with. But he was the one talking about escalation. Or now take the ICE raids with this frame in mind. Donald Trump was the one who vowed to carry them out. Here's the head fake.
The president promised massive immigration arrests.
The new plans for a large-scale ICE enforcement operation.
They're going to start next week. And when people come into our country and they come in illegally, they have to go out. They will be removed from the country. It starts, during the course of this next week.
The president pulling back on that order to start those deportation raids.
Trump says it's because Democrats asked him for the delay for negotiations.
And there's more evidence of the bluster coming to an end with no action. On the Mexico tariffs, there was a lot of tough talk. There was a countdown to this punishment. And it all ended, of course, with a head fake for a deal that Mexico and others said was largely already in place, meaning not a result of the threats. So Trump gets the red meat to the base, then knowingly not acting on the planned threat. Now, a lot of people, let's be clear, think it's a very good thing that we're not at war with Iran today, or there wasn't an extra strike. A lot of the humanitarians and other immigration folks we talk to say if these ICE arrests didn't happen, that's a good thing. And in the markets, there was a lot of people excited that there weren't new tariff wars. But what are we to do with all of this, especially when you have a president deliberately stoking chaos and fear to position himself to be the one to relieve it, but of course only momentarily? I can tell you that the president on the ICE raids is asking Congress to act within a few weeks, or he says he'll act again. Is that another head fake? Let me bring in my experts, Mara Gay from the New York Times editorial board, and Barbara Rez, a longtime Trump Organization executive and the author of All Alone on the 68th Floor. Good to see you both.
Hi. Likewise.
What do you think we should do with this? And when you look at even those three topics, do you think they're all pure head fakes?
So it's hard to know because, of course, the president does sit in the White House and does have the ability to start a war just with the stroke of a pen, and that's a little bit terrifying to me. But I do think that this presents an opportunity for Congress and then secondarily for the Democratic candidates to look like the adults in the room. Right now, it doesn't seem that there is one in the White House. And so there's a political opportunity there. But I also think, look, listen, this is Congress's job to stand up and actually call for stability. Iran, this is not an issue to be playing with, going to the brink and coming back. Same with the ICE raids. It's fear-mongering. And I think to understand the president and his actions, you really need to understand that he sees everything, or appears to, through the prism of what works for him politically. So I think, as you pointed out, Ari, this is really about throwing red meat to the base. And so,
do you think there was a chance he was going to do any of these things?
I don't know. I really don't know. And I think that, again, the important thing is for Congress to demand better of the president and that he, proceed with caution.
Do you know, Barbara?
Do I know? I was thinking about this. When it comes to the ICE thing, I think maybe that was a head fake. On the war or the striking in Iran, I'm not so sure about that. I think he might have wanted to do that and then somehow got scared out of doing it. And this is how he needs someone to blame when mistakes are made. And so far the mistakes have been bad mistakes, but they haven't been something like starting a war. I think he wanted to do it, and then he got sort of faked out himself, and that he had no backup for who he was going to blame when it didn't happen. Well, when it did happen, because when you think about it, he said, it was only a single-man drone. Well, he acted like he just found that out. I mean, I knew that days before. Everybody knew that. Then he said, I found out that we were going to kill 150 people. It's the first thing you ask. What's the cost of this strike? So I think he maybe wanted to do that, and I think at the end he sort of got scared out of it.
He's not really a hawk when it comes down to it in action. I mean, he's big into bluster and carrying a big stick, but he mostly talks a big game.
Well, historically, I mean, yeah, he's been a big threatener. Absolutely, there's no question about it. But he will do things that are really spur of the moment, that will be outrageous. He will do them if he's allowed to do it.
Well, and this goes to what I think diplomats around the world are trying to understand, right? Is where is the grand strategy? Or is he an improviser? And to the extent that he's improvising in a way that scares people, there are arguments, Barbara, well, that could be a good thing. There are other countries in the world that are led by people who are scary, better to be feared than loved and all that. Do you think that he's sort of improvising his way into what you would call a foreign policy, or that gives it way too much credit?
First of all, people say strategy with him like it's like the two go hand in hand. Donald Trump's strategy. I never saw that. I mean, I saw reacting more than strategy. But no, I think that I go back to what I was saying. I think he may have wanted to do a strike and sort of backed out of it.
I mean, my concern is that the United States seems to be increasingly going it alone. And I think combined with Brexit and just chaos in the European Union, I mean, the Western alliance is in a very delicate position. And that actually, I believe, is the best way to contain threats and to promote democracy around the world. And the president is not helping.
No, I totally agree with that. I think the biggest mistake he made was backing out of the deal that the United States made in good faith. I think that was a terrible mistake.
Well, Barbara, he had an obligation to back out of that because Obama made it.
You're right. That's absolutely right.
You can't do anything that Obama did.
Right. But that was a really bad step. And
do you think he came to any independent judgment? I mean, the core of I'm making a joke, but the premise of my joke is dead serious, which is it seemed that from what we learned from people around him, it was Obama made this deal, so I'm against it.
I truly believe that. I absolutely believe that.
Which is a bonkers way to make foreign policy, no?
Well, it's terrible, but I do believe that. But he also likes being this big bad guy. He absolutely likes that. And he's told me more than once, you like to be liked, you shouldn't be liked, you should be feared, that kind of thing. And he just has that attitude.
Do you miss him, by the way?
I miss him. He's in my face 24 hours a day.
It's true. He's here. He's here. Both panelists stay with me to broaden the conversation of what do you do if, as we're diagnosing, there is obviously some head fakery, but as one of our guests just explained, sometimes it might be real and accidental. I bring in the Atlantic's David Frum, who also worked in the White House himself as a speechwriter for George W. Bush. Good to see you.
Hey there, thank you.
What do you think we, and I mean collectively, not that there's any particular team, but we as a society and those of us who are in the press should do about all this? Because people are obviously frustrated with the pattern, but for the reasons stated, it's not all 100% ignorable.
It's, well, you can't ignore it as a citizen, but the world is taking the president's measure. Credibility is credit, and when your credit is gone, you have to pay cash. Look, this whole crisis on the border that is happening right now is a result of the president's loss of credit. The United States saw in 2017 a plunge in unauthorized border crossings because people in Central America, and Mexico too, but Central America is now the main source of unauthorized migrants to the United States, took a look at Donald Trump and said, this guy seems scary. He seems to mean it. We'd better be careful. And so you saw a huge reduction in the kinds of border crossings that had spiked in the summer of 2014, that returned a little in the summer of 2016, big drop off. By the early part of 2018, the word had gone out in Central America. Nothing's changed. In fact, the Americans are weaker than ever. And so border crossings began to rise in the second half of 2018 and are now moving at a rate that is the fastest rate of unauthorized border crossings since the peak of the 1990s.
You know who agrees with you?
1% of the population of Central America is on the move.
You know who agrees with you? Former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson, who I saw speak this last week. And the point you raised, he said basically Donald Trump's bluster on immigration bought 6 to 18 months, whatever, some period.
Yeah.
And he said, the problem with that is it's not policy. Bluster can scare in the moment, but in the long run, people will see and feel, especially when it comes to migration, what is actually being done on the ground, David.
Yes, and it also destroys your ability to do things. So Donald Trump wasted his year blustering about a wall that would be completely irrelevant to the problem, even if you could build it in something less than a decade, even if you had the money. He failed in the time when he had majorities of Republicans in both houses of Congress to act on the measures that would have tightened up the asylum system so as to cut off the temptation to people to undertake these incredibly hazardous journeys with children, with the results that we now see. The United States lured people in with weak enforcement, put them at risk, and now is holding some of them. Most of them are being released into the interior of the United States. But that is the result of Donald Trump's bluster. And the Iranians are reacting the same way, the North Koreans. Look, I come from the political right, and our core message for a generation has been weakness is provocative. Weakness tempts people to push the United States in ways in which the United States will ultimately not go. And Donald Trump is the most provocative and the most weak of all presidents.
I would just say, the reason that many of these people, these migrants, are coming to the United States is that because they are desperate and that they are fleeing incredibly violent experiences, whether through domestic violence or just the lawlessness in some of Central America. You're shaking your head, but I mean, the evidence.
The homicide rate in Central America has dropped by about 2/3 since it peaked in about 2011 and 2012, and it's been declining ever since. The rate of the migration has nothing to do with levels of violence in Central America. It has entirely to do with perceptions of enforcement in the United States.
I'll give Mara a chance to rebut. I mean, the reason why I mentioned Jay Johnson is he's no fan of Donald Trump. He has a similar theory that there was a depression. Now, with all social science, you have multiple variables. So I don't know that we're going to resolve this by the commercial break, but I'll give Mara a rebuttal.
I just want to say that the reporting that we and many other news organizations are doing on the border shows, actually talking to these individuals, these human beings, shows that they want a better life and that many of them are fleeing violent situations, whether that be gangs or just violence in their own families and a failure of their own states to protect them from it. So, there's no reason to litigate this, really, and there's nothing wrong historically with the United States of America welcoming refugees and immigrants to our shores. That's what we're supposed to be about.
David, do you want anything briefly before we go?
The asylum system is not supposed to be a response to trouble in people's societies. It's a response to persecution. That is, the authorities are coming for you. There's something that because of something you can't control. That's a benign personal characteristic. Your state is persecuting you. That's what asylum is for. That's not how you solve the problems of the world. And to go back to the president, I mean, the president sent very tough, fierce messages in 2017, and indeed he reduced the flows of migration through growling. But the world has taken his measure, and they're taking his measure in Iran. They're taking his measure in the Korean Peninsula. That he is provocative and he is weak both at the same time, and that's a very dangerous combination.
Right, and I think what I'm hearing, I mean, where you guys overlap is on looking at the limits of Donald Trump's rhetoric and how it worked, where you're debating, which could be an endless debate and one we welcome here, which is how many variables account for some of those shifts. But one thing we did establish that is demonstrable is that Barbara Reyes doesn't miss her old colleague and boss, Donald Trump, because you feel like he's all around you.
Absolutely.
Oh, we have fun, and I'm not afraid of silence. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.